Okay, hello, welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for people who like to chat books. Today it's me, Sarah, coming to you from the Netherlands, and I am joined by Jenny, coming to you from Norwich in the UK. We are covering a bit of a different topic today, and that is reading during particularly difficult periods in your life, and particularly during times of grief. This was actually a requested episode, so we really hope you guys get something out of it. And yeah, just to reiterate, if you have things that you would like us to cover or topics that you particularly like us to discuss, we are generally more than happy to do it. But this one should be good. So we're not going to do currently reading the normal section today because we literally just recorded a Patreon episode and we don't want to repeat ourselves too much. So we're not going to do current and recent reads today. What we're going to do at the top of the episode is Jen and I are going to talk a little bit about our personal experiences with grief. So if you don't want to listen to that particularly, and you just kind of want to skip ahead to the books, just have a look in the description. There should be chapter markers depending on your app, and you can skip around if you don't want to listen to that in particular. I do want to give a warning. Unfortunately, Jen and I both have quite a lot of experience with different types of grief. So in terms of content, we're probably going to touch on everything from suicide, miscarriage, cancer, sudden heart attacks, and everything. So if there's a particular type of grief or type of death that you would like to avoid, you might be out of luck in this episode. But once we've stopped talking about our particular experiences, we are probably not going to refer to it too much, is the goal. But I can't guarantee that at this point. But that's the idea. Right, Jen?
I'm feeling quite upbeat about the episode. So hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully the tone of the episode is not going to be miserable.
No, I don't think so. But if you are someone who is a bit nervous about listening, then please don't. Or play it through, give us the download, but you can mute it. That's fine. No problem. Any news from you, Jen? Is there anything before we start? Have you got anything to say? Has anything happened in your life?
Other than I've got a grotty cold, and I'm sorry, I know it's disgusting to listen to people that are nasally and snotty, but I'm hoping to contain it as much as I can. Blow my nose when I'm muted.
Well, you look great, so
thanks. Our whole household is disgusting at the moment.
Yeah, I'm about to go on a very big trip to Australia for several months. So at the moment, this is my last weekend in the Netherlands for many months. So at the moment, I'm sort of wandering around my house in a bit of a well, not at this exact moment, but this weekend I'm sort of wandering around my house in a bit of a daze, looking at things like, do I use that? Do I use that more than a few times a year? Like, what are my hobbies? What do I do with my evenings? And
Who am I?
Yeah, who am I? How do I entertain myself for such a long trip? It's kind of weird. I have done trips of this length before, but not since I was like early 20s. Not that I'm in my 20s now. I don't know why I'm early 20s. Not for about 10 years. So yeah, I'm not sure what I do with my life. So that's fun. Right. So I wanted to ask you, Jen, before we start, if you don't mind, how, for me, I find some days I'm very happy to talk about this sort of stuff, and some days absolutely not at all. And so when we decided we were doing this episode, I've been a bit nervous the whole lead up to it, to be honest, wondering how I'm going to feel on the actual day. So how do you have? First question: do you have a similar thing where some days you're fine, some days not?
I find, because I've got a slight array of experience with death in our family, I find some more triggering than others. So I've had my best friend from school died of cancer about 3 years ago, and my stepmother died of cancer about 5 years ago. I find cancer particularly triggering. It's something that I've talked about it before, but something I have to kind of work through on an ongoing, regular basis. But in terms of miscarriage, which I had a miscarriage when trying for my children, and it was a missed miscarriage, so it was one that I found out when I went for my 12-week scan. So I have 2 kids now. I'm not having any more. I'm kind of in a way out the other side of that. So obviously miscarriage now, I've been there and that part of my life is gone. So no, I don't find, actually I find it quite helpful and if I've ever talked about miscarriage or fertility issues on my Instagram or anything like that, then other people find it really helpful. So I'm much better at talking about my fertility experiences than I am with my cancer experiences. And then my father-in-law died of, it was a sudden heart attack. He had a cardiac arrest about, gosh, this is probably 5 years ago now. And unfortunately, he lived quite a long time with very severe brain damage after he'd had his heart attack. So there was a period in mine and Ben's life that was incredibly challenging. As a couple, he was experiencing a different kind of grief to what I was experiencing. So that whole period of our lives was messy. But I don't find death difficult to talk about, so I'm hoping I'll be fairly upbeat and I've got some good recommendations for this episode. But I still, it's one of those things that I don't, even though I've had all these experiences, I still don't feel like I've experienced grief for someone who's been super, super close to me. Yes, my friend died of cancer, and I guess we might touch on cancer later on, but cancer's a funny one because obviously someone gets diagnosed and then that whole process goes on a very long time, and then you get told that they've reached the stage where it's terminal, and then that process can go on a very long time. So that's almost like you almost live in the grief while it's happening. So when my friend died, yes, it was upsetting, and I was upset, and it was sad, but I felt I'd almost kind of gone through that grief process while she was still alive, which is also a very different thing to go through. So yeah, I feel like I've got the full gambit, apart from somebody really immediate to me, because both my parents are still alive. So it's that death is a funny one, and everybody experiences it very, very differently, and grief is different for everybody.
Yeah, well, I've sort of got the inverse to you, where I've actually not really experienced, apart from grandparents, which is a little bit different. I haven't experienced someone that particularly close to me getting diagnosed, and then us kind of waiting for them to die. So the two sort of big losses that I've had in my life were my father and a close friend of mine, both of whom died extremely unexpectedly. And so then with that, there's a whole element of trauma, because the way that this is delivered to you and the way that it happens is literally within a phone call, like a 30, someone telling you it takes 15 seconds, and your whole life is like suddenly completely different. So it's extremely traumatic, actually, something like that. But it's funny. One of my good friends has, their father has probably terminal cancer. And we sort of have this odd ongoing conversation of like, because we've been friends for a long time. So I know their dad really well, and they know my dad really well, knew my dad really well. Like whose dad's death is going to be worse? Is it worse to suddenly lose someone and have no memory? Like my dad was never sick, he was very healthy, right, literally until he died. Is that worse, or is it worse to see someone sort of slowly die over a very long period of time, which is a cheerful topic that we haven't quite agreed. I think it's worse for them, and I think it's worse for me, so we'll see.
It's fascinating.
Yeah,
nobody's grief is the same, even if you kind of think that they've been through the same death that you have. It's a fascinating subject.
Definitely. I'm luckily, so as I said, I was a bit worried about talking about this today, because I thought some days I can't even voice actually what happened to me or what happened to my dad. But today it's a sunny afternoon, so I feel very, very relaxed and contemplative today, so we're going to be fine. In terms of what happened to me, I also kind of like you, unfortunately, have known quite a lot of people who have died. But the two sort of major things that happened to me is that when I was 25, so about 5 years ago, just after I moved to the Netherlands, actually my dad died of a heart attack, and he died, he had no symptoms whatsoever. And the type of heart disease that he has doesn't have any symptoms. The only way that you can pick it up is if you, for some reason, do an angiogram, but there's no symptoms, so no one does that. So we had no idea that he was sick. He was only 53. And I just moved here. I think I've been here for about 6 months. And then one day my brother called me, and he was like, "Dad died," and I was like, "What?" Like it was unbelievable, really. And also my brother, God love him, he is he often will get things like slightly wrong. He sort of takes a small bit of information and he'll really run with it. So immediately I was like, I thought he was talking about someone else's dad. You know what I mean? I was like, well, that is obviously incorrect. So we had kind of an argument about it. That's how that happened. Yeah, and then I ended up sort of having to fly to Australia sort of oddly in a daze, just by myself, sort of, not knowing what was happening. So that was 5 years ago. And then a few years ago, a friend of mine who I had studied with here, he suicided, actually, and he and I was quite close to how this kind of all unfolded. And he actually died in our apartment, in the apartment I was living in at the time with my partner. So that was quite, I don't know, a lot. It was quite a lot. So those two were the sort of big two traumas and losses that I've lived through in the past sort of 5 years.
We're almost on, if you want to put these things on a scale, which we literally just said you can't, but we are pretty much the polar opposites in the experiences we've had.
Right, now we've got
pick up.
Now we've got to keep it light. Okay, so that's a little bit about us and the sort of context of what we're sort of referring to when we talk about times of trauma. So now we're going to pick it back up a bit for the rest of the episode, and keep in mind that this is, at the end of the day, a light-hearted entertainment podcast.
Yeah, no more trauma talk.
No more trauma
okay.
talk, yeah. But we will make probably quite a lot of recommendations as we start talking about these books now, about things that you can listen to. Yeah, if you do want to listen to something a bit more contemplative. So I've got some discussion points, Jen, so I thought I'd hit you with some questions. Mm-hmm. My first question is, in terms of reading during these kinds of times, do you feel like reading? How does I don't want to say your reading lifestyle as if it's so important, but yeah. How is your reading affected by this kind of stuff?
I'm the sort of person who doesn't read at all. I won't read at all. I don't think there's a single book that I could say that I've picked up when I've been in a place where I'm grieving or mentally I don't feel myself. So I watch trashy television. I think I've watched Gilmore Girls all the way through, all 7 seasons, 3 times. Or I don't even know how many episodes that is, but that's, if I'm watching Gilmore Girls, that might be the signal that it's not quite right. Mm-hmm. But no, in terms of reading, I just don't do it. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, that's okay. Like, even if you're in inverted quotes, a reader, like, you don't need to do it all the time. And I've definitely taken breaks from it and needed something a lot more mindless to do than read.
Yeah. I agree. Like, you know what I'm asking, but I didn't want to phrase it like, how is this important hobby that we have of reading affected? Because it's very important that we keep going. Yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah, I'm kind of the same, where after these sort of big periods of shock, I haven't read anything. And the first thing that I often will want to pick up, or the thing that I do feel like reading, will be something like a YA fantasy. So the first thing I read after my dad died was the Sabriel series by Mannix, which is he's an Australian author, I think. It's a YA trilogy, and it's very like, not like other girls. Girl is super talented at magic or something, and she's the only one that can overthrow I can't even remember, like, you know, the plot. And then she goes on some big quest across some, I don't know, big field on a horse. It becomes super magic, and she's very good and defeats the bad guy, I think is sort of the premise of it, or something, I can't even remember. But that's the kind of thing that I go for, sort of completely removed, really readable. Also, if I'm going through anything really difficult, honestly, that's what I always sort of go to YA fantasy. So like last year I was rereading The Raven Cycle by Leigh Bardugo, and I've also read, what else have I read? Probably stuff like Peter Jackson or Rick Riordan's stuff. That kind of stuff is what I'll end up turning to if I feel like, and it's more not because I feel like I should be reading and that's like the kind of level that I want to read. It's more that these sort of pretty fast paced, not that deep worlds. They tend to be quite absorbing, and so that's what I really like. And to read it, no offense to YA fantasy, we love it, but it's not like exactly a mind bender. So it's kind of similar to watching a TV show that you've seen a million times, reading a book about a girl who's not like other girls.
What are you saying about Gilmore Girls?
Sorry.
It's like comforting, isn't it?
Yeah.
To revisit somewhere that you're familiar with and you don't need to think about. And then the tone of it is, you don't particularly need to think about anything anyway. So,
exactly.
Something for the brain to do that's not too taxing.
Exactly. And then I'll often watch, this is not book related, but like Would I Lie to You, and those kind of panel shows that are just kind of dumb. That's what I often wind up doing.
Silly good fun.
Yep. So can you remember what, in terms of after your friend dying and after your miscarriage, can you remember what you first read?
No, I can't. I really feel like I just don't read until I'm ready to start reading again. So I probably don't even really need to like ease myself back in or anything like that. I think I just decide I'm going to pick up a book now. So no, I can't. There certainly isn't anything significant that I can think of.
So there's the YA fantasy thing that I just said, how I often feel like reading kind of dumb YA. And the other thing that I find, because for me, I sort of grief in waves or cycles or something. So even though these things have now happened a couple of years ago, there's also some sort of ongoing stuff in with my family and some of my friends that sort of brings back the grief that I have, sort of in a cyclical way, which is great. But when I'm in these like periods of still really feeling this quite raw loss, actually, at these times I still always feel like reading, but I get so annoyed with like so many different books, and this is a me problem obviously, but I just feel like so many books are so trivial and unimportant, and I get so annoyed with them. Like they really piss me off. And I'm like, how can people care about this? Like when people are dying, what does it matter? What is this stupid book? And I get so annoyed with like all of the new releases. I can't think of a single example, but any new releases about anything romance based, anything that's not trauma and really, really horrible death. I'm like, oh, how could you be an author and write something in good conscience about something so stupid and irrelevant? So when I'm in these kind of periods, I sort of come in and out of these periods, right? Yeah, depending on other things. So last year, one of the books that I read during this time was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, which is what we actually read it for the pod, but at this time, and because I was like going through some other stuff, Chris and Alice were like, are you sure you want to read? You don't have to. And I was like, yes. I couldn't read anything else apart from this book right now because everything else feels so dumb and like trivial to me, that I just want to read like the most
deep, dark, depressing book you can come up with. yeah.
And I just get so annoyed by other books, and I'm like, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. It doesn't matter. Which is obviously just my own grief speaking. But it's quite funny. So people often find it weird that that's what I'll be reading like when I'm going through some like awful stuff.
No, I get that. I totally get that.
Yeah.
That's not just a you thing. I know when I had my miscarriage, and I think anybody who's suffered any kind of child loss will find that, oh my god, social media can piss you off so much. I'd be like, why are you posting this? This is so irrelevant right now. How can you just post this willy-nilly when all this shit is happening to me? And I just have to step away. Like, come off Instagram, stop getting annoyed about people sharing their joy. Just, it's not their fault. Just unfollow them. It's fine. So I suspect that's a very familiar pattern of people that are grieving. Yep,
absolutely. A Little Life is one that I read last year during a hard period, which just felt like just the right level. It's just what I wanted. And then when my friend suicided, the first book I read after he died was Hamnet, because I felt like I just needed something that was about serious sad shit, and that's
just what I like. Plague and child death, please.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I was even complaining to you. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah, I do remember. Is it the funeral scene?
I wasn't happy with Hamnet because I didn't think it was sad enough. That was my problem.
Yeah,
And then all these reviews are like, oh my god. So Hamnet, sorry for people that I'm not giving enough context here. I sort of forgot that we're doing a book podcast. Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell is a book about Shakespeare's son who died when he was, I think, 8 or so, and it tells the story of Shakespeare and his family and this little boy Hamnet who died. It caused a big splash. Did it win the Women's Prize? Is that true? Yes, it won the Women's Prize.
Yeah, it won.
Caused a big splash when it came out, which was must have been 2020, and everyone who read it is like, what a sad book. It's so it's so sad, this little boy dying. Oh my god, I'm so sad. And I read it, and you even read it, and you really liked it. I think, yeah, you loved it.
I did really like it, yeah.
And I read it and I was like, Jen, this wasn't sad enough. I thought this was trivial. It's much worse than this, actually. And so she didn't, Maggie O'Farrell didn't go into like huge detail about like the horrendous trauma of a child dying, which is probably a good move, I would say. But I think my reaction was
might have sold less books.
Yeah.
She went too hard in there.
Yeah, it's probably quite difficult to sort of shoehorn in the deep despair of a loss of a child with it's a sort of a popular fiction novel.
Yeah.
But I was like, Jen, how could she write this?
I think what we're saying, listeners, is that there is a time and a place for reading certain books.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd like to reread it actually with better faith. I've got it here on my desk actually. See if I enjoy it a bit more. I'm sure I would. So yeah, that's sort of my two extremes. I'll go for something just incredibly sad or YA fantasy. Nothing in between. Nothing contemporary. That's for sure. Okay, cool. So now let's go through some books, shall we? We've kind of got thematically different books. So at the beginning, I'm going to talk about some fiction books that are not particularly dark or depressing, I would say, but both have characters who are going through different types of grief. So if you are someone who would like to read about grief, I would say sort of tangentially without it being a really dark topic that kind of overwhelms you. Particularly these two books, actually, I would recommend, especially if you have a friend maybe who's going through something and you would, if you're a little bit unsure what to say or you would like to sort of try and relate to them a little bit more, perhaps, these two I would really recommend. So the first one is New Animal by Ella Baxter, which we talked about in the Favourites 2023 episode, did we not? Because it was one of my favourite books of last year. So this is about a girl who works in not a morgue, she works in a crematorium, and her job, she's essentially an undertaker, so her job is to literally make up the bodies that are going to be the star of the funeral, and especially when people have open casket funerals, they'll do the makeup, and they have all these different tricks that they do to make the bodies look a little less horrifying. So that's her job, and her mother actually dies very, very unexpectedly, and she is not able to deal with this grief at all. So she ends up taking off to Tasmania, to a different state in Australia, and ends up getting involved in basically BDSM because she wants she's trying to deal with it. And I would recommend it because in terms of being about grief, it's quite indirect because she's not that much in touch with how she actually feels about her mother, and she's sort of in denial. So in terms of her having a lot of like introspective thoughts about her mother, she doesn't really have that. What it's more about is how grief can make you do bizarre things even when you don't really understand what's happening. And she's sort of, oh, it's all fine, it's absolutely fine, here I am, this is all fine. So it's that sort of the look at kind of the madness of grief without being too dark, I would say. In fact, not in my opinion, not even that dark at all, but I hesitate to say that because we know what a psycho I am in that respect. But yeah, I really recommend it for that kind of thing. And the other one that I recommend is The Spare Room by Helen Garner, which is another Australian novel. And this one is about two older women who are friends. I think they're in their 50s, or maybe their 60s. And they've been friends for a very long time. And one of them is diagnosed with a terminal cancer. And she is in a lot of denial about this cancer, and she's living with the other friend who's the main character. And so she's in denial about how sick she actually is. And she's getting sicker and sicker as she's staying with this friend. And what actually happens is that she meets some kind of like alternative medicine doctor who claims that he's going to be able to help her. And she ends up paying all of this money to go to these sort of holistic or alternative medicine treatments for her cancer, which are clearly not going to work. the main character, is very conflicted about whether she should just play along because the friend is going to die. Like, should she try and confront her? Should she try and make her go to a normal hospital and get actual medical treatment to help her symptoms? Is it better to let her live, thinking that the orange juice that she's drinking and the ginger root shots are going to do all this stuff? So she really struggles with how to deal with this. And it's also, quite unusually, it's two women who are older who are friends, and neither of them have partners, so it's got this sort of message about female friendship, which is very unusual, especially for older women, I would say, in books. And it's because they've been friends such a long time, and because the one who has cancer is kind of a bit ridiculous, and everyone's kind of used to her sort of antics. It's got a very like warm tone, I would say, and everyone's sort of navigating behind her back how they're going to deal with her and what they should say to her. So they all just love her very much, and they're just trying to do the best thing for her. But so it's got wonderful exploration of female friendship, especially long term friends, as well as this sort of tricky navigation of how it is when someone's dying, and your wishes and their wishes, and what you should be doing for them, and how difficult it is when there's probably not that much that can be done anyway, like how much of an obligation you have to try and make them face it, and should you make them face it, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I'm ready for that book now. And a year ago I probably wouldn't have been able to read was it The Spare Room?
The Spare Room, yep.
The Spare Room. But I think I'd like to read that one now. I know we've recommended it to a few of our Patreons, so yeah, I definitely would like to pick that up.
So now we've got a couple of non-fiction recommendations, do we not? That are more about sort of death itself, right? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've got a few. Some people may not know this about me, but I find the subject of death fascinating. So I own a lot of books about death. Now, that they're not about grief or grieving necessarily. They are literally books about the practicalities of people dying and people who do jobs. Do we call it the death industry? Maybe. So my first book is called Past Mortems by Carla Valentine, Life and Death Behind Mortuary Doors. Now, Carla Valentine is a pathology technician, so she works for the coroner's office. She is not the person that does the post-mortems on bodies, but she preps the bodies for post-mortem, which I just assumed one person did everything, but she does the kind of the grisly bit, really, where she cuts open the bodies, she removes the organs, she does what she's asked to do. She looks for like preliminary reasons why somebody might have died, but she isn't the person that does it's probably not called diagnosis, but you know what I mean. And it's just really, really fascinating. If anybody's read Adam Kay's book, This Is Going to Hurt, it's a similar tone, but not, Adam Kay's a comedian, so his is very comedic, but it is that kind of behind doors look at a job that anybody who doesn't do that job probably assumes it's really depressing, like they could never do it, that on a day-to-day basis they'd be miserable doing that job. These people don't dislike their jobs, they enjoy doing these jobs, and they have ways and means of coping with the jobs that they're doing. So at times they can be quite dismissive, jovial about what they have to do on a day-to-day basis. And I remember, there's quite grisly tales in this about like bodies that kind of haven't been left at the right temperature and that kind of stuff. So if that's not your kind of thing, which I totally get, it's not everybody's cup of tea, but if you do find that sort of thing interesting, then I think you'd really, really enjoy this. It's not dark in the sense that you're going to feel depressed reading it. It's just not that sort of tone. So if you're at all interested in another life, I feel like I would have made quite a good mortician, because I do quite like that sort of thing. So that's my first grisly recommendation.
Yeah, well, funny you say, because I've just added that to my TBR. Because I would like to be an undertaker in another life. I think I would do a banger funeral.
My friend's a celebrant, and she does a lot of funerals, and actually she prefers the funerals to the weddings, because she feels like it's a real honour to
Yeah.
give the person their sort of final send-off and their final celebration of life, and to work with the families through that really difficult period. And she loves her job and she loves doing it. And it's probably one of the last things you can really do for a person.
Yeah, I would really like to do it, and trying to coordinate with the families to try and get everyone a bit of closure. And also, so my dad used to do funerals as well. He was a minister, so he would do weddings and funerals, and he had a great, he was very, very good at hitting that excellent balance of being very serious, but also having joke, like keeping it sort of lighthearted so that everyone kind of gets through it. He was really good at it. So I went to many funerals conducted by him, and he had a great way of doing it that makes it sort of very serious and everyone feels very satisfied with what has happened, but with that sort of slightly joking tone, which means you can actually get through it. Not everyone's in tears for hours and hours. There's a real skill to it actually, is hitting that middle point. And he does at weddings. He would do the same thing, but it's not quite the same. Along the lines of people who work in the death industry, my recommendation is With the End in Mind by Katherine Mannix. Katherine Mannix is a palliative care doctor, and she lives in the UK, so she works in the UK. And so her job in palliative care, what they are doing is most of the time, I believe, working with people who are going to die, so who have a terminal illness. But sometimes it's with people who aren't going to die, but they're looking after people who have very, very serious illnesses and whose symptoms cause them a lot of trouble. So that could be pain. So they're treating the actual symptoms themselves to try and improve their quality of life. So, for example, if someone has cancer, that person will be in their unit not to get treatment for their cancer, but to get treatment for the pain and for the other problems that the cancer causes, just to help them be able to live a slightly better life. And oftentimes that will be to sort of make them comfortable for their last sort of days or weeks or months of life. And her memoir is talking about the different ways that people approach death. She sets it out in their little vignettes about people that she's had personal experience with, so a little bit like the Adam Kay book. And she talks about the completely different way in which people approach this, how different experiences she's had with different families where people disagreed, how she and the nurses have to kind of navigate this. It's a really incredible, and have so much respect for these people, and the way that they're able to, they just spend all day dealing with these sort of, horrible things that are happening, and they're able to just completely attend to the families, completely help them. There was one incredible story that she tells in the book, which is about a family. The mother was dying of cancer, and the son was a felon, so he was in prison, and he'd been in prison for a long time, and he got day release, and basically the day that the mother was going to die, so he was given day release to be able to go and say goodbye to the mother. And he came handcuffed with two different wardens, she was calling them, so two different staff members from the prison came with him, and they wouldn't leave his side, and he's completely handcuffed, and he's supposed to be saying goodbye to his mother, and he was really violent and really difficult, and everyone was scared of him. And of course the family haven't seen him for a long time, and obviously there's going to be decades and decades of really difficult relationships between him and his siblings. And she tells the story of how the head nurse was able to negotiate with the wardens and actually get him to get the whole room calmed down and have him there with the handcuffs off, actually, so he could more properly say goodbye to his mother. And of course it's not a story like she reformed him or whatever. Obviously it's a complicated family with a complicated history, but just for those couple of hours where it was really the mother's final hours, they were able to sort of make this happen so the family could be together, and just sort of assemble this moment of peace for them, which is probably a very isolated moment of peace, I imagine, in sort of their history. And then the mother was able to be there with all of her children who are actually getting along. And it was just amazing to read how they did this, and how next door, while this was all happening, she was next door dealing with like a child who was dying, like completely different circumstances. And they just sort of go all day from, and she describes herself as a death wife, sort of the opposite of a midwife. And it's everyone that they see is just having these kind of profound experiences where the person they sort of love most in the world is dying, and they're able to talk to these people. Then they go to the next room, have the same conversation with people again, and still be very engaged with people. And something that she talks about in the book, which is why I actually would recommend the book, is how people are often very unprepared for death, both for their own death and also for the death of people that they love, and how a lot of them don't want to have the conversations about what they want or what their funeral should look like or what things should look like after they die. And one of the jobs that she has with the nurses is to try and get people to have these conversations and to sort of confront the future, both from the side of the family and from the side of the patient themselves. And she talks about how she's able to do that. And she talks about, especially, obviously she's British, so she's talking from a British perspective. And she talks about how often people are very fearful of these conversations and they really have to try and sort of gradually get it out of them so that they're comfortable. And she talks about the process of dying itself, what it actually looks like, and how people are often quite scared of it, because these days, in times of old, people used to see people dying all the time, but now we sort of, people die in hospitals and you don't know what it looks like. So often people are quite frightened of the changes that happen when the person they love is going to die, and how they sort of coach people through that so that they're not frightened. It's really, really good.
Yeah, I own this one. Surprise, surprise. And yeah, I really want to get to it now that I've heard you talk about it. I'm going to move it to the top of my TBR.
I heard about the book because it was on, Katherine Mannix was interviewed on Griefcast, which is a podcast that I would really recommend, actually. This is a British podcast that's hosted by Carrie Lloyd, who is a comedian, and her father died when she was a teenager. And what she does in every episode is she interviews someone, normally a comedian, but not always, who has lost someone quite close to them, and they talk. It's quite focused on grief itself, so they will talk about the actual person in quite a lot of detail, what happened, how that person died, and how it kind of played out in sort of the months and years after the death. And she had Katherine on to talk, and she was brilliant. So we will link actually that specific episode because I really recommend it, and it gives you the way that she talks on the episode is exactly like how she is in the book. So if you enjoy the way that she is, you would enjoy the book. But if you don't like it particularly much, then the book's probably not for you. But yeah, a really, really good episode.
I have got 2 books that are about death and how people deal with death in different cultures. So the first one is called From Here to Eternity, Travelling the World to Find the Good Death by Caitlin Doughty, I want to say her surname is. So she's a mortician, but she's also got a YouTube channel. I'm pretty sure she's got millions of subscribers, and I will link it in the show notes because I can't remember what her YouTube channel is called. But this book, like the title says, basically travels the world looking at how they treat death and deal with death and celebrate death in different countries. And like you were just saying, certainly in British culture, get the impression Australian culture as well, we just don't really deal with death in the same way that other cultures and other people do. Like we don't want to hear about it, we don't talk about it. But this book, she talks about, the Day of the Dead in Mexico. And on that note, I'll just slip in the recommendation of the film Coco because I think a lot of people think they know what Day of the Dead is, and often people dress up and use the makeup at Halloween. I suspect if you quizzed them on actually how the Mexicans celebrate their dead, they probably wouldn't know. But if you want entry level, then the Disney film Coco is fantastic. But this book also delves into that culture as well, and why we're so fearful of death when other countries and other cultures do some amazing things surrounding the celebration of death is almost as big a celebration as the celebration of life events, if not more so. And their dead are often, not that we don't celebrate the death of loved ones, but we don't do it in the same way. Like, it isn't a celebration of life all the time. We don't honour the dead in the same way, and sometimes the way different cultures honour the dead we find quite offensive. So the whole book kind of delves into the different ways that cultures around the world deal with death. Yeah, it's really interesting. She's brought out some other books as well, which I haven't read. They're all non-fiction. I think one's called When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and the other one, which I think is a newer one, is called Will the Cat Eat My Eyeballs? So I just think she's great, and her YouTube's really great. Like her personality is fantastic, and she's very interesting person. So again, that's another recommendation if you kind of want to look at death in the practical sense.
Yeah, I've had this on my TBR forever. I really want to read this one. Actually, see our January Patreon episode for a discussion on books that have been on our TBR for a long time. Actually, this is one such one.
And then the other one that's related to that one, which I read a long time ago, but I really enjoyed, is called Sky Burial by British Chinese journalist Xinran. I read this years ago and I'd forgotten about it till I went through my Goodreads list for this episode. But she was brought up. So, sky burials are basically, it's a Tibetan ceremony where they essentially feed their dead to vultures. And she was brought up believing that this is some like barbaric process that the Tibetanese people did. But when she was an adult and was a journalist, she went and actually explored and wrote about this ceremonial process that they go through. And yeah, that book's really good, but just talking about Caitlin's book, it just reminded me that I'd read that book a long time ago and it was very good. My next two are non-fiction, but I'd say these are more about kind of working your way through grief. And very quickly going to mention Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. We did a whole episode on this just before Christmas, so I'll just link to that episode. We talk about it in great detail. But Cheryl Strayed has a very first-hand experience of loss, and some of the letters in that book deal directly with grief and loss, and I found them really fantastic. But the other book, and I may or may not have talked about this on the podcast before, I used to buy it for people all the time, probably about 10 years ago. I used to literally everybody, I'd be like, have I bought that book for you yet? And they'd get a copy. And it's called This I Know by Susannah Conway. Now, I can't even remember how I came across this book. I may have come across her on the internet because she had a blog in ye olden days of the internet. She definitely was a blogger. So she lost her partner very suddenly. He had a heart attack, and this book is essentially her memoir, but she works her way through her grief very creatively, or at least uses like creative processes to process her grief. And she does a lot of photography, so she does that through photography as well as like exercises that you can do if you're not into like mindfulness. And she isn't, dare I say, woo-woo. Cheryl Strayed's a little bit woo-woo, a little bit patronising in her tone. I don't know if it's because Susannah Conway's British, but she's not like that at all. So it's very much her talking through her life and the creative exercises she did to be more mindful and to process the grief that she was going through. But it's a really beautiful book. I'll just show you some bits and pieces. So it's full of her Polaroids. So she had a Polaroid. She found a Polaroid camera at like a car boot sale, and cool. Did a lot of stuff through like photography. But it's her memoir, and then dotted through it there's exercises for you to do, and they are like mindfulness exercises basically, but they are quite specifically to do with grief. So I read this book in my 20s, and at that time I hadn't experienced any real level of grief myself, but I have now. So it'd be really interesting. I briefly was reading this before we started recording, and it'll be interesting to read it in full again, and I'm going to do that soon. I'm going to get to it soon, but I think the exercises in it would mean a lot more to me now than they did back then. Let me just... So that at the end of the first chapter, she calls them reflections. At the end of the first chapter is just a really simple exercise about like listing the people, the family and friends and people that are close to you and why they're important to you. And yeah, she says about, you know, list out their qualities, and then the next bit is, you know, get in touch with them, reach out to them somehow.
That sounds like it would be a good one to read in conjunction with the Katherine Mannix one, actually.
Yeah, I think so. There was I was also going to say it's also got lots of quotes from other like books, which would be interesting, you know, as people that are interested in reading about death and grief. It's made me think actually I should go through some of the quotes, the books that she's quoting, and read some of those. But yeah, it's a lovely book, and I'd not forgotten about it, but I remember at the time I was literally buying it for everybody, but like, I've got to read this book. So out of all the books I talk about, I'm going to say that's my tip top recommendation, that one.
I don't think, if you have spoken about that, it's not been for years, I would say, because it's...
No, it's probably, if I have, it was probably right at the start of the podcast, I reckon.
It's not familiar to me. It sounds really good. I think these kind of books, I really, really like reading them. They can be a bit scary, for sure. But when you're in the right headspace, I think they're really, really wonderful, because they just help equip you. Like at some point, something's going to happen to you, or you're going to have a friend who's going through something. And something that I've noticed these kind of books have really done for me personally is, I mean, I have my own grief and I know how it feels, but unfortunately I have quite a few friends whose parents are very unwell. I've got one friend whose mother has Parkinson's, got another friend whose father has a terminal cancer. And I just, since I've started reading a few more of these kinds of books, I just feel a lot more equipped and a lot more confident about how I would bring this up, because I know I can emotionally relate to them like very much, but it is helpful, but actually being able to sort of have a bit of a framework for talking about it, like just because you know that it's awful and you feel sad and you know it's sad and they're sad, it is helpful, but it's not, you know, it's not, you don't sort of magically get good at talking to your friends just because everyone dies around you. So yeah, it's only really been since reading these kinds of non-fiction that I've felt a little bit more comfortable, especially because I haven't experienced this kind of long, slow, disease-based death before. Because you have to sort of, often people don't want to say exactly what's happening, but you want to know, like, if they say like the prognosis isn't good, sometimes it's good to know, like, if they are not telling you because they don't want to know what it is themselves, or if they can't say it. Like sometimes people can't voice what's happening, and so I just feel, these sort of books have just helped me be a little bit more equipped in that respect. So I love them.
Yeah, I think it is important. I think because people, especially when my friend was dying of cancer, something that I noticed was that they never really use like the medical terminology. So if they don't like using words like terminal, it's not necessarily them skirting around the issue, and sometimes they'll use words that are actually, when Ellie told me that, you know, she'd been given a terminal diagnosis, I think the way she phrased it was to say she'd been given her marching orders. So it's, yeah, I personally feel the more books like this that I can consume and prepare myself, that almost better support you will be for somebody.
Yeah.
If they want to talk about death like that in a jovial way, then that's okay. And yeah, whatever you can do to stay close to that person and be a support, as opposed to somebody who finds it too scary to talk to them about what's happening to them. I think you're dead right. Some of these books will really help with that.
Yeah. I get also on that note, I would say, if you're someone who's listening to this and you maybe haven't experienced it yourself, and especially if you're friends with someone who has experienced a big loss, and you don't know what to say, which can be really hard, knowing what to say. If you want some sort of generic advice, I would say don't be afraid to bring it up. There's a bit of a misconception that you'll make them sad or you'll make them remember it. They're never going to forget. Like, don't worry. Especially I've heard this a lot of people with my dad. They're like, oh, I didn't want to like remind you. I'm like, well, I know my dad's dead.
Oh my God, I hadn't forgotten.
Yeah, don't worry. Forefront of my mind, not to worry.
My dad had died.
And what? Yeah. Oh, that's right. And what? You're not going to make them sad, but it can be really hard if you're someone, especially if you're a bit younger and you're maybe the first person in your friend group to go through something like this. You can often feel that you can't talk about it, or that people have kind of forgotten. So it can be really nice. You can just say something super simple Anniversaries that's a really big, powerful thing you can do if you can just mark in your calendar like the anniversary of the death. So you can just simple text message like that, you know that it's the anniversary, that kind of thing. This makes a huge difference.
You're not reminding them, like,
no, you're not reminding them.
They are.
Yeah,
they are dealing with it on that day.
Yep. And it makes it to receive messages from people on an anniversary is a huge thing. So simple things like that. It doesn't have to be elaborate. And you can just say that you're thinking of them. Really. My last recommendation, which is slightly different, so more on the topic of God, this is a long episode. I just looked at the recording time. super quick. Last final recommendation, more on the topic of actually going through the experience of grief and death itself, is a book, one of my favorite books, which is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter, which is essentially poetry. We talked about this. We did a whole episode on this book, episode 45, which we will link in the show notes because it's one of my favorites. So I made Jenny and Sarah read it. I think that episode is really good, so I would go back and listen to it if you haven't listened to it before. But Grief is a Thing with Feathers is about a family, a son, two sons, and the father of the family, and the mother has died recently, and it is about how this family goes through that kind of initial shock, how horrendous it is, how insane it is. It's metaphorical, and it's about kind of how mad this process makes you go and how ridiculous it is, and how it's just insane and it doesn't make any sense and no one knows what to do and everyone's horribly sad, and it's just like a kind of weird madness where it's kind of hysterical because it's so ridiculous that this person has died. So it's quite a heavy book, but if you want something that is really about that very acute sadness and that very acute sort of shock and trauma, this is the one. I find it really pretty funny. I don't find it super depressing, but yeah, it is. That is more what it's about. And you really liked it, didn't you, Jen? From memory.
I loved it. There's definitely moments in it that I found upsetting, but at the same time, I do think it's funny. And the crow in it, it is quite. It's magical realism, isn't it? But there's a crow in it who is extremely inappropriate. And I loved him because it was so relatable to when you're in a grieving process. Everybody's really sad, but somebody will say something that's really funny and you all laugh, but then you all feel guilty because you're laughing. And I definitely haven't read a book that in a fictional way and a metaphorical way hit the nail on the head so well. It's just it's fantastic. It's really short.
It's a poetry book of 100 pages or so but it's the madness of grief is what I would say it's about. And it's, so if you're in that phase where you're just like, I feel like no one understands how ridiculous this is, that I would strongly recommend, and you can listen to our episode. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you got some good recommendations out of us, and we hope you enjoyed listening to this slightly different episode. If it's something that you really like and you would like to hear us do it again, please let us know. And like I said at the top, if you have topics that you would like us to talk about, we are probably happy to do it. I don't want to say definitely happy, but probably happy to do it. So just
it's probably worth saying that I don't think we would ever have picked this as a topic ourselves, because I don't think we knew how to tackle it or whether anybody would want to hear it. And
well, I wanted to actually, but then I didn't want to ask you because I thought so when someone
I didn't want to say anything. So it's really good to get some topics from our listeners.
Yeah, definitely. Everything that we talked about includes all the books that we've referred to, or all the books that we recommended, and podcasts and all that kind of thing will be in the show notes. If you want to get in contact with us, you can message us on Facebook. No, you can't. This is me quickly trying to wrap up and falling apart. If you would like to message us, we would love that, and you can on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter, and you can send us an email
and TikTok now.
And TikTok.
Can you believe it?
We're yeeting. Is that right? I don't know. You can email us also at thebookcastclub@outlook.com. If you would like to support the podcast financially, we have a Patreon account where you can get early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and also personalised book recommendations starting from as little as £2 a month. What else do we do, Jen? We've got a newsletter, which is really great, monthly newsletter. You can sign up for that on our website, and the links for all of that stuff will be in the show notes. But thank you very much for listening, and we will speak at you again in 2 weeks.
Well done. All unravelling there.
What did I say? Messages on Facebook. Add me on Facebook, you guys.